On a quiet suburban street, Officer Brian West patrols his usual beat, his actions guided by deeply ingrained prejudice. When he spots two young black girls walking home from a late-night tutoring session, he assumes the worst. Despite their protests, he arrests them, accusing them of suspicious behavior. Little does he know that just minutes later, his own life will hinge on the decisions of those he unjustly accused. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The streets of Elmwood Avenue were quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed both peaceful and unnerving. It was late, the streetlights flickering softly as a light breeze carried the faint hum of crickets. Officer Brian West rolled his patrol car slowly down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a kind of tension that had become second nature over the years. Brian wasn't a rookie anymore, he'd been on the force for over a decade. Experience had given him a sixth sense, or so he thought, for spotting trouble, and tonight, trouble came in the form of two figures walking briskly along the sidewalk. Brian narrowed his eyes, his attention snapping to the pair. Two young black girls, maybe teenagers, their backpacks slung over their shoulders, walked side by side, their heads bent toward each other as they spoke in hushed tones. They didn't look dangerous, not by any stretch of the imagination. But Brian wasn't thinking about that. What were they doing out at this hour? In his mind, their presence was enough to arouse suspicion. He slowed the car to a crawl, his headlights sweeping over the girls. They froze briefly, their conversation cutting off as they turned to glance at the patrol car. Brian's lips curled into a tight line as he pulled over to the curb. The girls hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances before continuing their walk. That hesitation cemented his decision. He flicked on his lights and stepped out of the car, the sound of the door closing sharp in the quiet night. "Hey, hold it right there," Brian called, his voice firm but not yet aggressive. The girls stopped, their bodies tensing as they turned to face him. The younger of the two, Mia Carter, looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. She couldn't have been more than 13, her round face framed by braids that swung slightly in the breeze. Her older sister, Alana, stood taller, her gaze sharper and more guarded. At 15, Alana had already learned to expect the worst in situations like this. "Is something wrong?" Officer Alana asked, her voice steady but edged with unease. Brian approached them slowly, his hand resting near his belt, not on his gun, but close enough to make a statement. "What are you two doing out here so late?" he demanded, his eyes scanning them from head to toe. Alana squared her shoulders, stepping slightly in front of her younger sister. "We're walking home from our tutor's house. Our mom couldn't pick us up tonight." Brian raised an eyebrow, his gaze darting to their backpacks. "From your tutor's house? At this time of night? That doesn't seem likely." "It's true," Mia chimed in, her voice small but firm. "She helps us with math. We just stayed late because we had a big test coming up." Brian tilted his head, his expression skeptical. "What's in the bags?" "Books," Alana replied quickly, her tone clipped. "And our schoolwork." "That's it?" "Mind if I take a look?" Brian asked, though it wasn't really a question. Alana hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Do we have to? We haven't done anything wrong." Brian's patience thinned. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "It's routine. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." Mia looked up at her sister, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. Alana sighed, then slowly shrugged off her backpack and unzipped it. She handed it over, her jaw tight as Brian rifled through its contents. Notebooks, a worn geometry textbook, a pencil case. It was exactly what she said it was. He handed it back without a word, then turned to Mia, who reluctantly did the same. Her bag revealed a similar assortment of school supplies. Brian frowned. There was nothing incriminating, but that didn't shake the unease he felt. Years of working the beat in neighborhoods like this had conditioned him to expect trouble where none existed. He decided to press further. "Where's this tutor live?" he asked. Alana gestured vaguely over her shoulder. "A few blocks back, near Maple Street." "And where's home?" Brian asked, folding his arms across his chest. "On Willow Drive, near the church," Alana answered, her tone growing colder. Brian squinted at her, trying to gauge if she was lying. He didn't know what he was looking for: hesitation, shifty eyes, anything that would confirm his suspicions. But Alana held his gaze unflinching. All right, Brian said finally. Let me see some ID. We're kids, Alana replied sharply. We don't have ID. And you don't need one to walk home. Her defiance rubbed Brian the wrong way. He stepped closer, looming over her. Watch your tone. I'm trying to do my job here. Your job is to harass two girls walking home, Alana shot back, her voice rising slightly. We told you where we were coming from and where we're going. What else do you want? Mia tugged nervously at her sister's sleeve. Alana, don't. But Alana was done holding back. This is ridiculous. We didn't do anything wrong. Brian's jaw tightened, his authority challenged. That's enough, he barked. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. What Alana exclaimed, her eyes wide with shock. You're resisting, Brian said flatly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Mia's eyes filled with tears as she clutched her sister's arm. Please, we're not doing anything bad. Officer, you can't just. Alana started, but Brian cut her off, grabbing her wrist and pulling her away from her sister. Hands behind your back. Now, he ordered. Alana struggled for a moment before reluctantly complying, her hands trembling as Brian cuffed her. He turned to Mia, who was crying now, and motioned for her to do the same. You're detaining us for walking home, Alana snapped, her voice cracking with anger. I'm detaining you for being uncooperative, Brian replied tersely, avoiding the full weight of her words. Mia sniffled, her hands shaking as she held them out. Please don't arrest us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Brian sighed, exasperated, as he cuffed her as well. It's just protocol. You'll be released once we've sorted everything out. As Brian led the girls to his patrol car, the quiet night seemed to press in around them. Mia sobbed softly, her small frame shaking as she tried to keep up with her sister's longer strides. Alana glared straight ahead, her jaw set in defiance despite the tears brimming in her eyes. They'd done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter. In that moment, they were criminals in the eyes of the man who held their freedom in his hands. Brian opened the back door of the cruiser and gestured for the girls to get in. Alana hesitated for a moment, looking back at him with a fire in her eyes that startled him. She didn't say anything, but her gaze spoke volumes. She wasn't afraid of him. She was angry, and she wanted him to know it. He slammed the door shut behind them, his frustration mounting. He wasn't sure why this encounter had gone the way it did, but it left him feeling unsettled. As he got into the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd made a mistake. But mistakes, as Brian was about to learn, have a way of unraveling in the most unexpected ways. The silence inside the patrol car was thick and heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffles from Mia in the back seat. Officer Brian West stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the quiet streets. His jaw was tight, his mind replaying the encounter on the sidewalk. Something about the older girl's defiant gaze lingered in his thoughts, though he couldn't quite put a finger on why it bothered him so much. From the back seat, Mia spoke softly, her voice trembling. Please, officer, can't you just let us go? We're not bad kids, we're just trying to get home. Brian didn't answer right away. He told himself he wasn't heartless, he was doing his job. Suspicion was part of the job. His instincts were finely tuned, and he had learned to trust them over the years. Yet her words carried a weight that gnawed at him, tugging faintly at the edges of his resolve. Alana leaned forward as much as the seatbelt and cuffs allowed, her voice sharp. She said, Please, aren't you supposed to protect people? What are we being protected from right now? Watch your tone, Brian snapped, his grip on the wheel tightening. My tone, Alana shot back, her voice rising. What about your actions? We didn't do anything wrong. You're treating us like criminals for walking home. What kind of person does that? That's enough, Brian barked, his voice laced with irritation. He glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his eyes narrowing. You think you're helping yourselves by mouthing off? Keep pushing, and I'll find something else to charge you with. Alana's nostrils flared, but she bit back whatever retort was on the tip of her tongue. Beside her, Mia looked at her sister with wide, tear-filled eyes, silently pleading for her to stop. The car fell into tense silence again, broken only by the faint static crackle of the police radio. Brian slowed the cruiser as he approached a stoplight. the intersection illuminated by the harsh glow of the streetlights overhead. The scene outside the window seemed still, almost frozen in time, a world separate from the turmoil simmering inside the car. He exhaled slowly, glancing down at the glowing dashboard clock. It was past midnight now, and the unease that had settled in his chest earlier was refusing to budge. Out of the corner of his eye, Brian noticed movement. A man staggered into the road, waving his arms frantically. The figure was illuminated by the car's headlights, a disheveled man in his late 40s, his face etched with panic. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair wild, and his voice trembled as he shouted, "Help! Please, officer, you've got to help me!" Brian slammed on the brakes, the patrol car jerking to a halt. He frowned as he rolled down the window. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone clipped, still carrying the weight of the confrontation with the girls. The man rushed to the driver's side window, his words tumbling over each other in a breathless panic. "There's a fire building down the block. My son is still in there. Please, you've got to do something." Brian's eyebrows shot up as he leaned forward slightly, peering in the direction the man had pointed. In the distance, faint plumes of smoke were visible against the dark sky, the faint orange glow of flames licking at the edges of the horizon. His gut twisted. Fires weren't his responsibility, they required backup, trained professionals. He wasn't equipped to handle this. "I'll call it in," Brian said quickly, reaching for his radio. "Stay calm." "No, there's no time," the man shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't understand, he's trapped. Please." "Sir, I need you to step back and help him," Mia's voice interrupted, startling Brian. The young girl leaned forward, her eyes wide with alarm. "You can't just sit here." "Stay out of this," Brian shot back, his voice stern. But her words had struck a nerve. "Are you serious right now?" Alana cut in, her voice sharp and disbelieving. "You've got time to arrest innocent kids, but when someone actually needs you, you're going to sit here and do nothing." Brian opened his mouth to retort, but the man's desperate pleas cut him off again. "Please, he's only 6 years old, he's still in there." A wave of discomfort rolled through Brian, followed closely by frustration. He glanced back at the girls in the rearview mirror, their eyes fixed on him, Mia's pleading and tearful, Alana's burning with defiance. He let out a heavy sigh, his mind racing. He was trained for control, for protocol, but this situation was teetering on the edge of chaos. "Fine," he muttered under his breath. Throwing the car into park, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out. "Stay here," he ordered the girls as he closed the door behind him. He approached the man, who wasted no time grabbing his arm and trying to drag him toward the direction of the fire. Brian resisted briefly, glancing back at the cruiser. The girls were watching him, their faces pressed against the glass. He cursed under his breath. As they neared the building, the sight hit Brian like a punch to the gut. Flames were consuming the structure, smoke pouring out of shattered windows and curling into the night sky. The heat was palpable, even from a distance. The sound of crackling wood and glass punctuated the air, mixed with faint cries from somewhere inside. "There," the man shouted, pointing frantically. "He's on the second floor. Please, officer, please." Brian's radio crackled to life, but the static was distorted, rendering the words unintelligible. He cursed again, slapping it against his palm in frustration. Of all nights for his equipment to fail. From behind him, he heard the unmistakable click of the cruiser's door. He spun around to see Mia and Alana stepping out, their cuffs jangling as they struggled to move. His face twisted in anger. "What the hell are you doing? I told you to stay put." "You need help," Alana said firmly, her voice carrying over the noise of the fire. "You can't do this alone." "I don't need help from you," Brian barked, but his voice faltered slightly. He looked back at the flames, the heat prickling his skin, the cries growing fainter. Time was slipping away. Mia stepped forward, her small frame trembling but determined. "You're wasting time yelling at us. That little boy needs help." Brian hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The flames roared louder, as if mocking his indecision. He clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He didn't trust these girls, not after how the night had begun, but the situation was spiraling out of his control. Alana took another step closer, her voice steady. "We're not the enemy, officer. Let us help." For a moment, Brian's grip on control slipped entirely. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face before nodding begrudgingly. Fine. But if you get in my way, I swear. We won't, Alana interrupted. She turned to Mia, gripping her sister's shoulders. Stay low, stay close to me. Brian watched as the girls moved with a focus that surprised him. Despite the cuffs on their wrists, they navigated the chaos with a calm he hadn't expected. His frustration gave way to something unfamiliar and uneasy respect. As they moved closer to the building, Brian's heart pounded in his chest. The flames seemed to grow brighter, louder, as if daring them to come closer. He had no idea what was about to happen, but one thing was clear: nothing about this night was going according to plan. The fire roared like a living beast, its flames clawing at the sky as the heat pressed against their skin, suffocating and oppressive. Officer Brian West stood frozen for a moment, his flashlight useless against the raging inferno. The building, an old 2-story brick structure, was a crumbling skeleton engulfed in chaos. The flames licked through the shattered windows, and smoke billowed in thick, black clouds, making it almost impossible to see. This is insane, Brian muttered under his breath, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. Every instinct in his body screamed to wait for backup, to follow protocol. But protocol wouldn't save the boy trapped inside, whose faint cries for help carried over the roar of the fire. Mia and Alana, still in handcuffs, moved with surprising calmness to his side. Alana's eyes scanned the building, assessing the situation in a way that seemed far beyond her years. Mia clung close to her sister, her fear palpable but her resolve steady. "What's the plan?" Alana asked, her tone sharp and commanding. It startled Brian. She sounded like someone accustomed to being listened to, even by adults. Brian blinked at her, caught off guard. "The plan? The plan is for you to get back in the car where it's safe." "We don't have time for that," Alana shot back. She pointed toward a side window where the flames hadn't yet reached. "We can get in through there, but we'll need to hurry. The fire's spreading fast." "You're not going in there," Brian snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't some game. I don't need a couple of kids making this worse." Alana's jaw tightened, and she took a step closer, her cuffed hands trembling slightly. "Listen to me. You can't do this alone. That boy's life depends on us working together. So either take these cuffs off and let us help, or stand here wasting time." Brian stared at her, a mixture of anger and something uncomfortably close to respect brewing inside him. She was right, and he hated that she was right. The boy's cries grew fainter, a chilling reminder that every second counted. With a growl of frustration, Brian pulled out his key and unlocked their cuffs. "Fine," he barked, "but you listen to me. You do exactly what I say. When I say, no arguments." Alana nodded curtly, her expression grim. "Deal." Mia rubbed her wrists where the cuffs had been, her eyes wide and glassy. "What do we do first?" Brian motioned toward the side window Alana had pointed out. "That's our way in. I'll boost you two up. Stay low once you're inside and don't go wandering off. Got it?" The sisters nodded and Brian led the way, his heart hammering in his chest. As they reached the window, he cupped his hands and hoisted Alana up first. She climbed through with surprising agility, disappearing into the thick smoke. Mia hesitated, glancing up at her sister and then back at Brian. "It's going to be okay," he said, softer this time. "Just stay close to her." Mia nodded, her lip trembling, and let Brian lift her through the window. Once both girls were inside, Brian hauled himself up, his arms straining against the heat and weight of his gear. The smoke hit him like a wall, thick and acrid, burning his throat and stinging his eyes. He coughed violently, pulling his shirt up over his nose in a futile attempt to block the fumes. Inside, the scene was even worse than it had looked from the outside. Flames danced along the walls, and the air was a searing blanket of heat. The floor creaked ominously beneath their feet, threatening to give way at any moment. Alana was already moving, crouched low as she scanned the room. "The stairs," she called, pointing to a narrow staircase on the far side of the room. "He's upstairs." Brian grabbed her arm before she could run. "Slow down. We don't know if the stairs are stable." "We don't have time to be slow," Alana shot back, pulling free from his grip. Before Brian could argue, a loud crack echoed through the room as a beam collapsed from the ceiling, sending a shower of embers cascading down. Mia screamed, covering her head, and Brian instinctively shielded her with his body. His heart was racing now, the reality of their situation slamming into him with full force. "All right, move," he shouted, motioning for them to follow him toward the stairs. "Stay close and watch your step." The stairs groaned under their weight as they ascended, each step feeling like a gamble. Brian led the way, his flashlight barely cutting through the thick smoke. He could hear the boys' cries more clearly now, faint but distinct, a small, terrified voice calling out for help. "Over here," Alana yelled, darting ahead toward a doorway at the end of the hall. Brian cursed under his breath, hurrying after her. Inside the room, the boy was huddled in a corner, his small frame shaking with sobs. He couldn't have been older than 6, his tear-streaked face smeared with soot. The flames were creeping closer, licking at the edges of the room as the air grew hotter and thinner. Alana dropped to her knees beside him, her voice soft and soothing. "Hey, it's okay. We're here to help you. What's your name?" Evan, the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. "Evan, we're going to get you out of here," Alana said firmly. She looked up at Brian, her eyes urgent. "We have to move now." Brian nodded, scooping the boy into his arms. The child clung to him tightly, his small hands gripping Brian's uniform, as though his life depended on it, which, Brian realized grimly, it did. They turned to leave, but the hallway was now fully engulfed in flames. The fire had spread faster than Brian had anticipated, cutting off their escape route. His chest tightened as panic threatened to take hold. "What do we do?" Mia cried, her voice high-pitched and frantic. Brian scanned the room, his mind racing. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke choking. His eyes landed on a window at the far end of the room. It was small, but it might be their only chance. There, he shouted, motioning toward the window. "We're going out that way." Alana nodded, grabbing Mia's hand and pulling her toward the window. Brian followed, Evan still clinging to him. He reached the window first, smashing it open with the butt of his flashlight. Cool night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside. Brian turned to Alana. "You first. Climb down and get to safety." She hesitated, looking at Mia. "What about her?" "She's next," Brian assured her. "Go." Alana nodded, swinging her legs over the windowsill and carefully lowering herself onto the fire escape. Once she was secure, Brian lifted Mia up, helping her climb out. Finally, he turned to Evan, who was trembling in his arms. "You're going to be okay," Brian said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I've got you." He climbed onto the fire escape, the metal railing hot to the touch. The flames roared behind him, threatening to consume the building entirely. Step by step they descended, the fire escape creaking ominously with each movement. When they finally reached the ground, the cool grass beneath their feet felt like a blessing. Brian set Evan down, who immediately ran into his father's waiting arms. The man sobbed openly, clutching his son as though he would never let go. Brian collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His uniform was soaked with sweat, his face streaked with soot. He looked over at Alana and Mia, who were sitting a few feet away, their faces similarly smudged but their expressions triumphant. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Brian closed his eyes, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. This night had changed something, he could feel it. But he wasn't ready to face what that meant. Not yet. The fire raged on, consuming the old building behind them as firefighters arrived, rushing to contain the inferno. Their voices barked orders over the chaos, the rhythmic hiss of high-pressure hoses adding a new layer of noise to the scene. Officer Brian West stood off to the side, his hands on his knees as he caught his breath. His uniform was damp with sweat, his skin streaked with soot. Every muscle in his body ached, but his mind refused to quiet. Beside him, Alana and Mia sat on the curb, leaning against each other. Alana's arm was wrapped protectively around her younger sister, who was still trembling. The sisters were covered in soot and grime, their clothes singed in places, but their expressions held a quiet defiance that Brian couldn't ignore. They hadn't just survived, they had fought to save a life, and they had succeeded. Brian glanced at them, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest. These girls, whom he had labeled troublemakers just an hour ago, had risked their lives to help him save that little boy. It didn't make sense, not in the way he'd been taught to see the world. And yet here they were, proving every one of his assumptions wrong. Evan's father approached them, the young boy cradled in his arms. Tears streaked the man's soot-smeared face, his gratitude evident in every step. He knelt in front of Alana and Mia, his voice breaking. Thank you so much. You saved my son. I don't even know how to thank you." Mia shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Alana, however, met the man's gaze head-on. "You don't have to thank us," she said quietly. "We just did what anyone would do." Brian frowned at her words. He knew better. Most people wouldn't have done what they did, especially not teenagers caught in a situation as terrifying as this. The firefighters moved swiftly around them, the water from their hoses cutting through the flames. One of them approached Brian, his helmet tucked under his arm. "You were the first on the scene?" the firefighter asked. "Yeah," Brian replied, his voice hoarse. "We heard the kid screaming inside. We went in and got him out." The firefighter's eyes flicked to the girls, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You all went in?" Brian nodded, though he felt a pang of guilt admitting it. It was a team effort. The firefighter gave a low whistle, shaking his head. "Lucky you made it out in one piece. That building was a death trap. You're lucky it didn't collapse." Brian grunted in acknowledgement, the firefighter's words sinking in. Lucky, that was one word for it. He glanced at the girls again, his thoughts churning. They hadn't been lucky, they had been brave, resourceful, and calm under pressure. Far more than he had given them credit for. The firefighter moved on, leaving Brian alone with his thoughts. He walked over to the curb where the girls sat, his footsteps heavy. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't even know where to start, but he knew he owed them something. An apology, at the very least. Before he could speak, Alana looked up at him, her expression hard. "So what now?" she asked, her voice edged with bitterness. "You going to arrest us again?" Brian winced, the words cutting deeper than he expected. "No," he said after a moment. "No, I'm not." Mia looked up, her eyes wide. "Does that mean we can go home?" "Yes," Brian replied, though the answer felt more complicated than it should have. "You can go home." Alana's eyes narrowed. "Just like that? After everything?" Brian opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. What could he say? That he had misjudged them? That he'd been wrong? He wasn't sure if they wanted to hear it or if he even had the right to say it. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the moment. A man in a crisp suit, his badge clipped to his belt, strode toward them. Brian recognized him immediately, Lieutenant Henry Jacobs, his superior officer. Jacobs's face was a mask of authority, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. "Wes," Jacobs said, his voice firm. "What's going on here?" Brian straightened, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "There was a fire, sir. A young boy was trapped inside. We managed to get him out." Jacobs's eyes flicked to Alana and Mia, his brow furrowing. "And who are they?" "They helped," Brian said quickly, surprising himself with the defensive edge in his voice. "They were passing by when it happened." Jacobs raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on the girls. "Is that so?" "Yes, sir," Brian replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jacobs seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. "All right, good work, all of you. We'll need statements from everyone involved, of course." Alana bristled at the mention of statements, but Mia nudged her gently, her expression pleading. "It's okay," Mia whispered. "Let's just get it over with." Jacobs gestured for one of the officers on the scene to approach, instructing them to take the girls' statements. Brian watched as Alana reluctantly followed the officer, her head held high. Mia trailed behind her, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. Brian turned back to Jacobs, who was now studying him intently. "You look like hell, West." "Feel like it too," Brian admitted. Jacobs's expression softened slightly. "You did good tonight. Saving that kid. That's the kind of thing that reminds us why we do this job." Brian nodded, but the words didn't sit right with him. He wasn't sure if he'd done good or if he'd just gotten lucky. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left a mark on him, one he couldn't yet define. As the scene began to wind down, Brian found himself drawn back to the girls. They stood by the squad car now, their statements complete. Alana's posture was rigid, her arms crossed over her chest, while Mia leaned against her, her exhaustion evident. Brian approached them hesitantly, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Hey," he said awkwardly, his voice softer than before. "I just wanted to say, thank you for what you did back there." Alana's eyes narrowed. "You're welcome, I guess. Not like we had a choice." Brian flinched at her tone but nodded. "I know, but you didn't have to help. And you did. That says a lot about who you are." Alana studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. Finally, she sighed. "We're just trying to get home, officer. That's all we've ever been trying to do." Mia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we go now?" Brian hesitated but eventually stepped aside. "Yeah," he said quietly, "you can go." As they walked away, Brian watched them, his chest tight with a strange mix of regret and admiration. The events of the night had shaken something loose inside him, something he wasn't ready to face yet. But as the girls disappeared into the darkness, one thing was clear: the world didn't look quite the same as it had a few hours ago. For better or worse, tonight had changed everything. The patrol car's engine hummed softly as Officer Brian West drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. His usual beat felt alien tonight, every shadowed corner and dimly lit alley taunting him with unspoken truths. The fire was out, the boys safe, and the girls gone home, but the weight of the night clung to Brian like the smoke still soaked into his uniform. He had thought he'd feel relief, maybe even pride, for saving a life. Instead, he felt raw, exposed, and unmoored. The girls' words echoed in his mind. "We're just trying to get home," simple, unassuming, and yet laden with an indictment he couldn't shake. They hadn't asked for trouble, he brought it to them. And when it mattered most, they hadn't hesitated to save him, save the boy, while he had doubted them at every turn. Brian shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. His instincts, his training, everything he'd relied on to navigate the job suddenly felt flawed. Those girls had been braver and more composed than he'd ever given them credit for. And why hadn't he? Because they didn't fit the narrative he'd built in his mind over years of policing. The sharp chirp of his radio snapped him out of his thoughts. "All units, report of a disturbance near Maple and 3rd. Possible armed suspect. Responding officers use caution." Brian's hand hovered over the receiver. Normally he'd be the first to jump in. His track record for quick responses was part of what he prided himself on. But tonight, he hesitated. His head wasn't clear, and his confidence felt like a house built on sand. Another voice crackled through the radio. "Unit 12 responding. En route." He exhaled, relieved someone else had taken it. Let them handle it. Tonight he needed space to think, to process. The thought of going home crossed his mind, but the idea of sitting alone in his cramped apartment, surrounded by silence, was unbearable. Instead, he found himself turning down Willow Drive, the girls' street. He told himself he wasn't intentionally going there, that it was just muscle memory guiding him back toward a neighborhood he patrolled often. But deep down, he knew better. The Carter family's small, weathered house came into view. Its porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the cracked sidewalk. Brian slowed the car, parking a few houses down. He had no intention of knocking on their door. What could he possibly say? Instead, he leaned back in his seat, staring at the house. He wondered if Alana and Mia were asleep, or if they too were lying awake, replaying the night's events. A faint rustling outside the car caught his attention. Brian sat up straighter, his hand instinctively reaching for his flashlight. Two figures emerged from the shadows, their movements cautious but deliberate. His pulse quickened until the faint light revealed who it was: Alana and Mia. Brian frowned, stepping out of the car as they approached. "What are you two doing out here?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Alana crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated before answering, his voice quieter. "I was just passing through, making sure everything was okay." Alana arched an eyebrow. "We're fine. You don't need to babysit us." Mia, standing slightly behind her sister, tugged on Alana's sleeve. "It's late. Let's just go back inside." But Alana didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Brian, challenging him. "Why are you really here?" Brian sighed, glancing down at the ground. He felt exposed under her scrutiny, like she could see through every carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself. Finally, he met her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because tonight, you showed me something I didn't want to see." Alana's expression softened slightly, though her guard didn't drop entirely. "What's that?" "That I was wrong," Brian said simply. "About you. About a lot of things." The silence that followed felt heavier than the smoke-filled air they had escaped earlier. Brian didn't expect her to forgive him, didn't even know if he deserved it. But he needed her to know that he understood, even if it had taken him far too long. Alana tilted her head, studying him. "It's not about being wrong, Officer West. It's about what you do next." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. What would he do next? Apologizing was easy, empty, even if it wasn't backed by action. But changing, that was harder. Before he could respond, a loud crack split the air. The three of them froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the noise. Another crack followed, unmistakably a gunshot. Brian's training kicked in instantly. "Get inside," now he barked, stepping in front of the girls as he scanned the street. But Alana didn't budge. "That sounded close," she said, her voice tense. "Exactly," Brian snapped. "Which is why you need to." A scream cut him off, sharp and panicked. It came from a block over, toward Maple and 3rd, the disturbance call he'd ignored. Adrenaline surged through him as he turned to the girls. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't come out until it's safe." Without waiting for a response, he took off toward the sound, his hand on his holstered weapon. The night felt electric, the air crackling with tension. As he approached the corner, he slowed, his footsteps careful and deliberate. A small group of people was gathered outside a corner store, their faces pale and drawn. One of them, a woman in her 30s, clutched a child to her chest, her voice trembling as she tried to explain to another officer what had happened. Brian's eyes scanned the scene, his heart hammering in his chest. The store's glass door was shattered, and inside a man paced erratically, waving a gun in the air. His movements were jittery, his eyes wild with desperation. "Put the weapon down," one of the officers shouted, his gun drawn. The man didn't respond. His gaze darted between the officers, the shattered glass, and the terrified cashier cowering behind the counter. He was cornered, and Brian could see the danger in his posture, the kind of desperate unpredictability that could end in tragedy. Brian stepped forward, his hand raised in a calming gesture. "Hey," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "What's your name?" The man's head snapped toward him, the gun trembling in his grip. "Stay back," he shouted. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I will, if I have to." Brian held his ground, keeping his tone calm. "Nobody wants that. But we can't help you if you don't talk to us. What's going on? What do you need?" The man's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. I just need money. That's it. Just enough to get out of here." Brian nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Okay, we can figure that out. But the gun, it's scaring people. Put it down and we'll talk." For a moment, it seemed like the man might listen. His grip on the weapon slackened slightly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his panic. But then, a car backfired in the distance, the sudden noise shattering the fragile moment of calm. The man flinched, his finger tightening on the trigger. "No," Brian shouted, stepping forward. In one swift motion he lunged, his hand closing around the man's wrist as he wrenched the gun away. The two of them hit the ground hard, the gun skidding across the floor. Other officers rushed in, pulling the man off Brian and securing him in handcuffs. The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the distant wail of sirens. Brian sat up, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His hands shook not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through him. As he looked around, his eyes landed on the cashier, who was still crouched behind the counter, her face pale but unhurt. "You're safe now," Brian said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. As he stepped outside, the cool night air washed over him, grounding him. The scene was contained, the threat neutralized, but Brian couldn't shake the weight of what had just happened, or the realization that he had almost ignored the call entirely. Tonight had been a reckoning. For the first time in years, Brian West wasn't sure who he was or who he wanted to be. But as he looked back toward Willow Drive, he knew one thing for certain: change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. The police station was unusually still for this time of night, its fluorescent lights casting a cold, sterile glow over the cramped desks and worn chairs. Officer Brian West sat in the corner of the break room, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The events of the night replayed in his mind like a film he couldn't pause, each moment sharper and more vivid than the last. The fire, the girls, the gunman, each had left its mark on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. His usual armor, built from years of routine, authority, and confidence, felt battered and full of holes. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, much less how he could face the next day. The door to the break room creaked open, and Lieutenant Henry Jacobs stepped inside. Jacobs, a seasoned officer with graying hair and an imposing presence, carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all and perhaps too much. He poured himself a cup of coffee before turning his sharp gaze to Brian. "You look like hell," Jacobs said, his tone more matter-of-fact than concerned. Brian didn't bother looking up. "Feel like it too." Jacobs took a seat across from him, studying him for a moment before speaking. "I read the initial reports. Busy night." Brian let out a dry laugh, the sound devoid of humor. "You could say that." Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've known you a long time, West. You've always been steady, reliable. But tonight something's different. What's going on?" Brian hesitated, staring down at his coffee. He could feel Jacobs's gaze on him, patient but unyielding. Finally, he let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair, his shoulders sagging. "I don't know," Brian admitted. "I keep thinking about those girls, the ones from the fire. Alana and Mia, they saved that kid, Lieutenant. They were brave, smarter than I gave them credit for. And I treated them like criminals before any of that happened." Jacobs nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "And now you're questioning yourself." Brian looked up at him, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I am. Because if I can be that wrong about them, what else am I wrong about? How many other people have I judged without even realizing it?" Jacobs was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "It's a hard thing to face, West. Realizing you've got blind spots. But recognizing them, that's the first step toward doing better." "Is it?" Brian asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What does better even look like? Do I just pretend I didn't screw up tonight? Move on like nothing happened?" Jacobs's gaze hardened slightly. "No, you own it, you learn from it, and you make damn sure you don't let it happen again." Brian shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "It's not that simple. Those girls, they trusted me to get them home safe, and I failed them. I made them feel like they didn't belong, like they were suspects in their own neighborhood." Jacobs leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Then do something about it. Talk to them. Show them you're willing to listen, to learn. But don't sit here wallowing in guilt. That doesn't help anyone." Brian opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the buzz of his phone. He pulled it from his pocket, his brow furrowing as he read the message come outside. "We need to talk." The sender's name made his stomach tighten. Alana Carter. "How?" Brian muttered, his voice trailing off. Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "Something important?" Brian hesitated before standing. "Yeah, I think it is." Outside, the air was cool and crisp, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in muted shades of gray and blue. Brian scanned the parking lot until he spotted them, Alana and Mia, standing near a lamppost at the far end of the lot. Alana's posture was as defiant as ever, her arms crossed over her chest, while Mia stood close to her side, clutching a small backpack. Brian approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't expected to see them again so soon, and certainly not here. "What are you two doing here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Alana's eyes narrowed. "We needed to talk to you. Thought it was fair, considering how much talking you did to us earlier." Brian winced, her words hitting their mark. "All right," he said quietly. "I'm listening." Alana glanced at Mia, who nodded slightly. Taking a deep breath, Alana stepped forward, What happened tonight, it's not the first time we've dealt with someone like you. Someone who looks at us and assumes the worst. It's not new, but it doesn't get easier, and I'm tired of it." Brian opened his mouth to respond, but Alana held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish," she said firmly. "You treated us like criminals because we didn't fit into your idea of who belongs in this neighborhood. But when it came down to it, we proved you wrong, and that's not something we should have to do." Mia spoke up then, her voice trembling but steady. "We just want to be seen for who we are, not what you think we are." Brian nodded slowly, his throat tight. "You're right," he said finally. "You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I treated you, for the assumptions I made. I screwed up, and you deserve better." Alana's expression softened slightly, though her guard didn't drop entirely. "Saying you're sorry is a start. But what are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else?" Brian hesitated, her question cutting through him like a knife. He had spent years on the force, following the rules, doing what he thought was right. But tonight had shown him that the rules weren't enough. That doing better meant more than just showing up, it meant changing the way he saw the world. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But I promise you this, I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to start by listening. To you, to others who've been through what you have. I'm done assuming I know everything." Alana studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "All right, we'll see if you mean that." Mia smiled faintly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. "Thank you," she said softly. Brian felt a lump rise in his throat. "No," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make this right." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the three of them stood in silence, the weight of the night slowly giving way to the promise of a new day. For Brian, it was a beginning one he wasn't sure he was ready for, but one he knew he couldn't avoid. The day after the fire dawned with a strange clarity, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Officer Brian West sat in his cruiser parked outside the station. He had been sitting there for over an hour, staring at the dashboard, trying to summon the courage to face what lay ahead. His world felt off kilter, as though the foundations of his beliefs had shifted overnight. The events of the night before played on a loop in his mind: the fire, the girls, the gunmen. Every detail was sharper in the light of day, and every misstep felt heavier. He sighed, finally stepping out of the car. The station was already buzzing with activity, officers moving in and out, phone lines ringing, and radios crackling with dispatch updates. It was business as usual, but Brian knew it wasn't usual for him. Not anymore. As he walked through the hallway, he caught snippets of conversation. The fire and the rescue had become the talk of the station. Some praised his bravery, others marveled at the girls' involvement. What none of them understood, however, was the weight Brian carried, the knowledge that his actions leading up to the fire had been anything but commendable. Lieutenant Jacobs was waiting for him in the squad room, his arms crossed as he leaned against a desk. His sharp gaze met Brian's as soon as he entered. "West," Jacobs said, gesturing for him to come over. Brian approached, feeling like a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office. "Morning, Lieutenant." Jacobs didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're the subject of a lot of chatter this morning. People are calling you a hero." Brian flinched at the word. "I don't feel like one." Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Brian hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because before any of that happened, I treated those girls like they were criminals. I profiled them, and if I'd just listened to them from the start, maybe things would have gone differently." Jacobs nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, you screwed up. But what matters now is what you do with that. Are you going to let it eat you alive, or are you going to use it to change?" Brian didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure he had an answer. But Jacobs's words stayed with him as he moved through the day, each task and interaction underscored by a nagging sense of urgency to do better. Later that afternoon, Brian found himself standing outside a modest brick building in the heart of the community, a local youth center. The building had seen better days, its paint peeling and its windows streaked with grime, but the sound of children laughing inside gave it a sense of life and purpose. He had no idea what he was doing there. He had heard about the center in passing, how it served as a safe space for kids in the neighborhood, many of whom came from underprivileged backgrounds. He had never set foot inside before, but today it felt like the place he needed to be. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by a cheerful cacophony of voices. Kids of all ages filled the room, playing games, working on art projects, or chatting in small groups. A woman in her 40s, wearing a brightly colored scarf, approached him with a curious expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. Brian cleared his throat. "I'm Officer Brian West." I wanted to talk to whoever's in charge." "That'd be me," the woman said, crossing her arms. "I'm Angela Carter, the director. What's this about?" The surname caught his attention, and his stomach tightened. "Carter? Are you related to Alana and Mia?" Angela's eyes narrowed. "They're my nieces." "Why?" Brian took a deep breath. "Because I owe them and your whole family an apology." Angela's posture stiffened, but she didn't say anything, allowing him to continue. "Last night I let my assumptions get the better of me," Brian admitted. "I treated your nieces like they were suspects instead of kids walking home. And then, when everything went sideways, they stepped up and showed more courage than I did. They saved a boy's life, and they saved me from myself, in a way." Angela studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want from me, Officer West?" "I don't want anything," he said quickly. I wanted to say I'm sorry, and I wanted to ask how I can help. I don't want last night to be the end of the story." For a long moment, Angela didn't respond. The noise of the center seemed to fade into the background as she regarded him, her gaze piercing. Finally, she nodded toward a cluster of kids gathered around a basketball hoop in the corner. "You see those kids," she said. "They're here because they're trying to stay out of trouble. But it's not easy when they know people out there, people like you, already see them as trouble before they've done anything." Brian swallowed hard, her words cutting deep. "I know. That's what I want to change." Angela's eyes softened slightly. "If you're serious about that, then start here. Volunteer. Get to know these kids. Show them that not every officer out there sees them as a threat." Brian nodded, a flicker of determination igniting in his chest. "I will." Over the next few weeks, Brian kept his promise. He volunteered at the youth center regularly, helping with everything from tutoring to organizing basketball games. At first, the kids were wary of him, their trust slow to build. But little by little, they began to warm up to him, their smiles coming more easily, their laughter less guarded. Alana and Mia were frequent visitors to the center, and though their interactions with Brian were initially strained, they too began to soften. One afternoon, as Brian helped Mia with her math homework, she looked up at him and smiled. "You're not so bad, Officer West," she said, her tone teasing. Brian chuckled, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "Thanks, Mia. I'll take that as a compliment." Alana, sitting nearby, watched the exchange with a small, grudging smile of her own. "Don't get too comfortable," she warned. "We're still keeping an eye on you." Brian nodded, his expression serious. "Fair enough. Keeps me on my toes." One evening, as the center was closing, Angela pulled Brian aside. "You've made a difference here," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "The kids see it, and so do I." Brian felt a lump rise in his throat. "I'm just trying to make up for my mistakes." Angela shook her head. "It's more than that. You're showing these kids and yourself that people can change. That's worth something." As Brian stepped outside into the cool evening air, he felt a strange sense of peace. He knew he still had a long way to go, that his work was far from finished. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. The night of the fire had been a turning point, a moment when everything he thought he knew had been called into question. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Brian was ready to face it, one step at a time. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood as Officer Brian West parked his patrol car near the Carter family's home. He hadn't been assigned to this area in weeks, yet he found himself returning. It wasn't out of obligation, nor out of guilt. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement of the connection forged through fire, fear, and a shared will to do better. As he approached the house, the front door opened, and Alana Carter stepped out onto the porch. She was carrying a small stack of books, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted neutral, cautious, but not entirely unwelcoming. "Back again?" she asked, setting the books on the railing. Brian smiled faintly, stopping a few feet from the porch steps. "Not officially. I'm off duty." Alana raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think cops knew how to turn that off." "Some of us are learning," Brian replied, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "I came by to talk. If you're up for it." Alana hesitated, glancing back toward the door. After a moment, she shrugged. "Fine. But you're talking to both of us." She stepped back inside, and Brian waited, listening to the faint murmur of voices from within. Moments later, she returned, with Mia close behind. The younger girl offered a tentative smile as she joined her sister on the porch. Brian cleared his throat, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other night, about how it's not just about saying sorry, it's about what I do next." Alana crossed her arms, her gaze steady. And I've been trying to figure out how to make things right," Brian said. "Not just with you, but with this community. I've spent years seeing things a certain way, and now I know how much I've been missing." Mia tilted her head. "What are you going to do about it?" Brian took a deep breath. "For starters, I've been volunteering at the youth center. Angela's got me helping with everything from tutoring to basketball games." Mia's face lit up. "You're helping with basketball?" "Not well," Brian admitted with a grin. "But I'm trying." Alana smirked faintly, but her posture remained guarded. "That's good, I guess. But what about when you're back on duty? What happens the next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong? Are you going to remember this, or are you going to fall back into old habits?" Brian met her gaze, his voice steady. "I won't forget. You've made sure of that. And I've started working with my department to address some of those habits. We're setting up community programs, ways to bring officers and residents together outside of calls. I've also been pushing for training on recognizing bias for all of us." Alana raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ambitious." "It is," Brian admitted. "But it's a start, and I know it's not enough on its own. That's why I'm here. I wanted to thank you, both of you, for opening my eyes. You didn't have to, but you did, and it's made all the difference." Mia stepped closer, her expression softening. "We didn't do it for you," she said. "We did it because we didn't want anyone else to get hurt. But I'm glad you're trying." Alana's gaze flicked between her sister and Brian. Finally, she sighed, her arms dropping to her sides. "All right, I'll give you that. But if you mess this up, don't expect us to let it slide." Brian smiled, the tension in his chest easing. "I wouldn't expect anything less." Over the next few weeks, Brian's efforts began to take root. The community programs he helped implement brought officers and residents together in ways he had never imagined possible. Potlucks, basketball tournaments, and open forums allowed people to share their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to come down. Alana and Mia became regulars at the events, their presence a constant reminder of why Brian had started this journey. Alana often challenged him, questioning his choices and pushing him to think deeper. Mia, on the other hand, became an unexpected ally, her quiet encouragement keeping him grounded. One evening, during a community meeting, Angela Carter stood up to speak. She addressed the room with her usual blend of warmth and conviction, her words carrying weight. "We've come a long way," Angela said, her eyes sweeping across the room. "But the work isn't done. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without all of us. What we're building here, it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about creating something better." Brian listened intently, her words resonating deeply. He knew she was right. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was worth every step. After the meeting, Angela approached Brian, a small smile on her face. "You're doing good work, Officer West. I didn't think I'd say that a month ago, but here we are." Brian chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Thanks. Means a lot coming from you." Angela's smile widened. "Don't let it go to your head. There's still plenty left to do." Months passed, and the changes in the community continued to grow. Brian's relationships with the residents deepened, and he found himself seeing his role as a police officer in a new light. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about building trust, understanding, and connection. One afternoon, as he patrolled the neighborhood, Brian spotted Alana and Mia walking home from the youth center. He pulled over and rolled down his window, grinning at them. "Need a ride?" he asked. Alana smirked. "We're good. But thanks." Mia leaned closer, her expression mischievous. "Unless you're offering a ride to the basketball court." Alana's got a rematch with Marcus, and she needs someone to carry her trophy home. Alana groaned. "Mia." Brian laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Tell you what, if she wins, I'll personally carry the trophy. Deal." Mia grinned. "Deal." As they walked away, Brian watched them, his chest filled with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly serve and protect, not just with authority, but with compassion and humility. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Brian sat on the steps of the youth center, watching the kids play on the court. The laughter and shouts filled the air, a symphony of hope and resilience. And for the first time, Brian felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The journey hadn't been easy, and it was far from over. But as he looked out at the community he had once misunderstood, he knew one thing for certain: change was possible. And it started with a single step.